Beloved people, listen to me carefully. I want you to hear not just with your ears, but with your heart. I want you to listen not with your mind alone, but with your spirit. Because today, something is shifting. Today, something is changing. Today, something is being rearranged in your life. Even while you sit there and think nothing is happening, stop worrying. Yes, stop worrying. Tell your neighbor, stop worrying. Tell yourself, stop worrying. Because God is taking care of everything today. Many people think faith means never having problems. But that is not true. Faith does not mean the absence of trouble. It means the presence of God in the midst of trouble. Faith does not mean you will never face storms. It means you will not sink in the storm. Faith does not mean you will never cry. It means your tears will not be wasted. Look at your life. Look at your situation. Look at your challenges. Look at your unanswered questions. Some of you are worried about your future. Some of you are worried about your family. Some of you are worried about your health. Some of you are worried about your finances. Some of you are worried about your past mistakes. Some of you are worried because doors seem closed. Some of you are worried because time is passing and nothing seems to change. But I came to tell you something today. While you are worrying, God is working. While you are crying, God is arranging. While you are confused, God is orchestrating. While you feel stuck, God is moving pieces you cannot see. Worry is the language of fear. Faith is the language of heaven. When you worry, you are speaking the language of fear. When you trust, you are speaking the language of heaven. Why do you worry so much about tomorrow when you cannot control today? Why do you worry about things that are beyond your power? Why do you carry burdens that were never meant for your shoulders? Listen to me. Worry does not add a single day to your life. Worry does not solve problems. Worry does not open doors. Worry does not heal wounds. Worry does not change the past. Worry does not control the future. Worry only drains your strength, steals your peace, and blinds you from seeing what God is already doing. Some of you are tired not because you are working too hard, but because you are worrying too much. You sleep, but your mind is awake. You eat, but your heart is heavy. You smile, but inside you are breaking. You pray, but you still doubt. You say you trust God, but your heart is still shaking. Let me tell you something. God is not worried about your situation. God is not confused about your future. God is not surprised by your problems. God is not intimidated by your enemies. God is not limited by your limitations. You see chaos, but God sees order. You see delay, but God sees timing. You see impossibility, but God sees opportunity. You see the end, but God sees a new beginning. There are things happening in the spiritual realm that your eyes cannot see. There are doors opening that you have not yet reached. There are battles being fought on your behalf that you are not aware of. There are connections being prepared for you that you have not yet met. If your eyes could see what God is doing behind the scenes, you would stop worrying immediately. But because you cannot see, you worry. Because you cannot understand, you fear. Because you cannot control, you panic. Listen to me carefully. Faith is not about seeing everything clearly. Faith is about trusting even when you cannot see. Some people think they will trust God after everything is solved. But that is not faith. Faith is trusting God before everything is solved. Some people say, when my situation changes, I will have peace. But God says, have peace first, and your situation will change. Peace is not the result of answered prayers. Peace is the evidence of trust. Look at the birds in the sky. They do not worry about tomorrow, yet they are fed. Look at the flowers in the field. They do not stress about the future, yet they are clothed with beauty. If God takes care of them, how much more will God take care of you? Why do you think God brought you this far only to abandon you? Why do you think God saved you only to forget you? Why do you think God called you only to destroy you? No. God is not a careless God. God is not a forgetful God. God is not a confused God. Sometimes God allows silence, not because God is absent, but because God is working quietly. Sometimes God delays, not because God is denying, but because God is preparing something bigger than what you asked for. You asked for a small blessing, but God is preparing a large one. You asked for a temporary solution, but God is preparing a permanent answer. You asked for comfort, but God is preparing transformation. But while God is preparing, you are worrying. Let me speak to your heart today. Stop worrying about what people say about you. Stop worrying about who left you. Stop worrying about who betrayed you. Stop worrying about who did not support you. Stop worrying about who misunderstood you. People may leave, but God remains. People may fail you, but God never fails. People may change, but God is constant. People may forget you, but God remembers you. Some of you are worried because you feel alone, but listen carefully, you are not alone. Even when you feel abandoned, God is present. Even when you feel rejected, God is close. Even when you feel forgotten, God is attentive. The problem is not that God is absent. The problem is that worry has made you blind to God's presence. Worry is like a cloud that covers your spiritual vision. Worry is like noise that blocks your ability to hear God. Worry is like weight that slows your spiritual movement. When you worry, you focus more on the problem than on the God who can solve the problem. Let me ask you something. Who is bigger, your problem or your God? If God created the heavens and the earth, can God not handle your situation? If God controls the universe, can God not control your circumstances? If God has power over life and death, can God not change your story? Some of you are worried because you think time is running out. You look at your age, you look at your opportunities, you look at your past, you look at your mistakes, and you say, it is too late. Listen to me. With God, it is never too late. God can restore what you lost. God can rebuild what was destroyed. God can revive what was dead. God can rewrite what seemed finished. Your timeline is not God's timeline. Your speed is not God's speed. Your understanding is not God's understanding. Sometimes God waits until the situation looks impossible so that when the miracle happens, nobody will doubt that it was God. Sometimes God allows you to reach the end of your strength so that you can discover the power of divine strength. Sometimes God allows you to lose control so that you can learn to trust. You are worried because you want to control everything. But life is not controlled by your hands. Life is guided by God's wisdom. When you try to control what only God can control, you will always be anxious. Let go. Yes, let go. Release your fears. Release your expectations. Release your frustrations. Release your bitterness. Release your anxiety. Put them in God's hands. Your hands are too small to carry what only God's hands can handle. Some of you have been praying, but instead of peace, you still feel pressure. Why? Because you pray, but you still hold on to worry. Prayer without trust is just noise. Prayer without surrender is just words. Prayer without faith is just routine. When you truly hand your problems to God, you will feel peace even before the answer comes. Peace is not the absence of problems. Peace is the presence of God in the midst of problems. I want you to understand something today. God is not only working when you see results. God is also working when you see nothing. God is not only moving when things improve. God is also moving when things seem stagnant. God is not only answering when you receive miracles. God is also answering when you are being trained, prepared, and transformed. Some of you are worried because you compare your life with others. You see people moving forward while you feel stuck. You see people succeeding while you feel delayed. You see people celebrating while you feel silent. Stop comparing. Comparison is the thief of joy. Comparison is the enemy of contentment. Comparison blinds you from your unique journey. Your journey is different. Your process is different. Your timing is different. God is not late in your life. God is not slow in your story. God is not confused about your destiny. God is taking care of everything today, even if it does not look like it. Listen to me. There are things God is removing from your life that you are still crying for. There are people God is separating from you that you are still begging to stay. There are doors God is closing that you are still trying to open. But God sees what you cannot see. Sometimes what you call loss is actually protection. Sometimes what you call delay is actually preparation. Sometimes what you call rejection is actually redirection. If God allowed everything you wanted, you would destroy yourself without knowing it. So stop worrying. Stop worrying about the door that closed. Stop worrying about the opportunity that passed. Stop worrying about the relationship that ended. Stop worrying about the plan that failed. God is not finished with you. Your story is not over. Your destiny is not cancelled. Your future is not destroyed. What you see as the end is often the beginning of something greater. Some of you are worried because you feel weak, you feel tired, you feel spiritually dry, you feel emotionally exhausted, you feel mentally overwhelmed. Listen to me. Weakness is not the end. Weakness is an invitation for divine strength. When you are weak, God is strong. When you are empty, God fills. When you are tired, God renews. When you are confused, God directs. Stop pretending you are strong. Start trusting the one who is truly strong. You do not need to have everything figured out. You only need to trust the one who has everything under control. Let me say this again. You do not need to understand everything. You only need to trust God. Some of you want explanations before obedience, but God often asks for obedience before explanations. Some of you want clarity before faith, but God often asks for faith before clarity. Some of you want proof before trust, but God often asks for trust before proof. That is the nature of faith. Faith is walking even when you cannot see the road. Faith is believing even when you cannot feel anything. Faith is trusting even when everything seems uncertain. Stop worrying about what might happen tomorrow. Tomorrow is not in your hands, but it is in God's hands. Stop worrying about what people think about you. Your identity is not defined by people's opinions, but by God's purpose. Stop worrying about your past. Your past cannot cancel your future. Stop worrying about your mistakes. God can turn your mistakes into testimonies. Stop worrying about your failures. Failure is not the opposite of success. Sometimes it is the pathway to success. Today, I want you to make a decision in your heart. A decision to stop worrying. Not tomorrow, not next week, not after everything changes. Today. Because God is taking care of everything today. Even while you are listening to these words, God is working. Even while you feel uncertain, God is arranging. Even while you feel afraid, God is fighting for you. There are battles you will never fight because God has already fought them for you. There are dangers you will never face because God has already blocked them. There are tears you will never cry because God has already wiped them away before they came. But worry makes you blind to these realities. I want you to imagine something. Imagine what your life would look like if you truly trusted God. Imagine the peace you would have if you stopped worrying. Imagine the joy you would experience if you believed that God is in control. Your heart would be lighter. Your mind would be calmer. Your spirit would be stronger. You would walk differently. you would speak differently. You would think differently. Because when you trust God, your perspective changes. Problems no longer look like mountains. They look like opportunities for miracles. Delays no longer look like punishment. They look like divine timing. Challenges no longer look like curses. They look like training grounds. Stop worrying. I know some of you will say, it is easy to say, but difficult to do. Yes, it is difficult, but it is possible. You cannot stop worrying by your own strength alone. You stop worrying by shifting your focus. When you focus on problems, worry increases. When you focus on God, peace increases. What you focus on determines what controls you. If you focus on fear, fear controls you. If you focus on God, God's peace controls you. So today, shift your focus. Instead of asking, what if everything goes wrong? Start asking, what if God is working everything out? Instead of saying, I don't know how I will survive, start saying, God knows how I will survive. Instead of saying, I am finished, start saying, God is not finished with me. Your words shape your reality. Your thoughts shape your emotions. Your faith shapes your future. Stop speaking worry. Start speaking faith. Even if your situation has not changed, let your language change. Say, God is taking care of everything. Say, I am not alone. Say, this situation will not defeat me. Say, what I see is not the final story. Sometimes the miracle does not start in your circumstances. It starts in your mindset. When your mindset changes, your life begins to change. Some of you are waiting for God to change your situation, but God is waiting for you to change your perspective. Stop worrying. I am speaking to someone who has cried silently at night. I am speaking to someone who smiles during the day but breaks down inside. I am speaking to someone who feels strong outside but feels weak inside. Listen to me. Your tears are not ignored. Your prayers are not wasted. Your struggles are not unnoticed. God sees everything. God sees what people do not see. God hears what people do not hear. God understands what people do not understand. And today, God is taking care of everything. Even if you do not feel it, even if you do not see it, even if you do not understand it. Sometimes God's greatest works are invisible at first. A seed is planted under the ground before it becomes a tree. A baby grows in the womb before it is born. A miracle is prepared in the spiritual realm before it manifests in the physical realm. So stop worrying because you cannot see immediate results. The fact that you cannot see does not mean nothing is happening. It only means God is working in ways beyond your understanding. Let me tell you something powerful. Worry is a sign that you are trying to play God in your own life. But you are not God. You cannot control everything. You cannot fix everything. You cannot predict everything. So why try? Surrender is not weakness. Surrender is wisdom. When you surrender to God, you are not giving up. You are handing over control to the one who knows better. Stop worrying. Today, make a decision in your heart. A decision to trust. A decision to rest. A decision to believe. Even if your situation is still the same, let your heart be different. Because when your heart changes, your destiny begins to change. God is taking care of everything today. Not tomorrow, not next month, not someday, today. And if God is taking care of everything, what are you still worried about? Let your heart be calm. Let your mind be at peace. Let your spirit be strong. Because what you cannot handle, God can handle. What you cannot change, God can change. What you cannot understand, God already understands. Stop worrying. Your story is in God's hands. And God never fails. Listen to me carefully. I want you to hear this not just with your ears, but with your heart. Trust is the door worry cannot open. Many people are knocking on the wrong door. They are crying, struggling, thinking, calculating, imagining, fearing, and worrying Yet the door before them remains closed. They push harder with anxiety. They knock louder with fear. They beg with desperation, but nothing opens. Why? Because worry has no key. Worry has no access. Worry has no authority. Only trust can open the door that leads to God's intervention. Look at your life. Look at the moments you were afraid. Look at the times you felt lost. Look at the days when you thought everything was finished. In those moments, worry spoke louder than faith. Worry told you that you were alone. Worry told you that nothing would change. Worry told you that your situation was permanent. But worry was lying. Worry always lies. Worry exaggerates problems and minimizes God. Worry magnifies danger and hides divine help. Worry makes you feel like the future is already destroyed, even when God is already preparing restoration. Trust is different. Trust does not shout, but it stands firm. Trust does not panic, but it rests. Trust does not demand immediate answers, but it waits with confidence. Trust is not blind optimism. Trust is deep spiritual understanding that even when you cannot see, God is still working. Trust is the quiet assurance that what you cannot handle, God can handle. Trust is the inner conviction that what you cannot control, God already controls. Many people think trust is easy when everything is going well. But real trust is revealed when everything is shaking. Real trust is tested when your prayers seem unanswered. Real trust is proven when your situation looks worse instead of better. It is easy to trust when you have money, when your health is strong, when people support you, when doors are open. But when the money is gone, when the body is weak, when people leave, when doors are closed, that is when trust becomes a battle. Some of you are fighting that battle right now. You smile in front of people, but inside you are trembling. You speak words of faith, but your heart is full of questions. You pray, but your mind is filled with fear. You say you believe, but worry still controls your thoughts. Listen to me. God is not angry with you for feeling afraid. God understands your weakness. God sees your struggle. But God is calling you higher than worry. God is inviting you into trust. Trust is not pretending that problems do not exist. Trust is knowing that problems do not have the final word. Trust is not denying reality. Trust is believing that God's reality is greater than your reality. Trust is not ignoring pain. Trust is believing that pain is not permanent. Trust is not closing your eyes to danger. Trust is opening your heart to God's power. When you trust, something changes inside you before anything changes around you. Your heart becomes calm even when the storm is still raging. Your mind becomes stable even when your environment is unstable. Your spirit becomes strong even when your body feels weak. Trust creates an atmosphere where God's power can move freely. Worry creates an atmosphere where fear dominates and faith suffocates. Some people ask, why does worry block blessings? Why does worry delay miracles? Why does worry make life heavier? Because worry is like a wall between you and God's promises. It does not change God, but it changes your ability to receive what God is doing. Imagine rain falling from the sky. If you put a roof over your head, the rain will not touch you. The rain is still falling, but you cannot receive it. In the same way, God's grace may be flowing, God's help may be available, God's intervention may be near, but worry acts like a roof that blocks your ability to receive. Trust removes that roof. Trust opens the door. Trust creates access. Trust allows God to move in your life in ways you never imagined. That is why trust is the door worry cannot open. Look back at your past. Think about the times when you worried so much about something that never happened. Think about the nights you lost sleep over problems that later disappeared. Think about the fears that seemed real but turned out to be illusions. If you could calculate how much energy you wasted on worry, you would be shocked. Worry stole your peace, your joy, your focus, your strength, yet it solved nothing. Now imagine if that same energy had been invested in trust. Imagine if instead of worrying, you had rested in God. Imagine if instead of fearing, you had believed. Imagine if instead of panicking, you had surrendered. Your life would have been lighter. Your heart would have been freer. Your journey would have been calmer. Some of you are still carrying burdens from the past. You are worried about mistakes you made years ago. You are worried about words you spoke in anger. You are worried about opportunities you missed. You are worried about decisions you regret. Listen to me. Worry cannot rewrite the past. Only God can redeem the past. Trust opens the door to redemption. Worry closes it. Some of you are worried about the future. You look ahead and see uncertainty. You see competition. You see instability. You see risk. You see danger. But you forget something important. You are not walking into the future alone. God is already there. The future that scares you is the future God has already prepared for you. When you trust, you walk into the future with confidence. When you worry, you walk into the future with fear. Fear and trust cannot rule your heart at the same time. One must dominate. If worry dominates, trust becomes weak. If trust dominates, worry becomes powerless. That is why you must make a decision every day. Will I feed my worry or will I feed my trust? Will I listen to fear or will I listen to faith? Will I focus on problems or will I focus on God? Trust is not a feeling, it is a choice. Sometimes you do not feel like trusting. Sometimes everything inside you wants to worry. Sometimes your emotions push you toward fear. But in those moments, trust becomes a decision. You decide to trust even when you do not feel like it. You decide to believe even when your mind is full of doubts. You decide to surrender even when your heart is restless. When you choose trust, something supernatural begins to happen. Your inner world starts to change. Your reactions change. Your words change. Your expectations change. You stop reacting like someone who is defeated, and you start responding like someone who knows God is in control. Some of you have been knocking on doors with worry for a long time. You have tried to solve everything with your own strength. You have tried to control everything with your own wisdom. You have tried to predict everything with your own understanding. But the doors remain closed, and you wonder why nothing changes. The answer is simple. You are using the wrong key. Trust is the key. Trust is the door. Trust is the access. When you trust, you allow God to fight battles you cannot fight. When you trust, you allow God to open doors you cannot open. When you trust, you allow God to change hearts you cannot change. When you trust, you allow God to rearrange circumstances you cannot rearrange. Some people think that if they stop worrying, everything will collapse. They think worry is a form of responsibility. They think if they do not worry, things will go wrong. But worry is not responsibility. Worry is a sign of insecurity. Responsibility is doing what you can do and trusting God with what you cannot do. Worry is trying to do what only God can do. You were never created to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. You were created to walk with God. You were created to depend on God. You were created to trust God. When you worry, you act as if everything depends on you. When you trust, you understand that everything ultimately depends on God. Trust does not mean you will never feel afraid. Trust means fear will not control your decisions. Trust does not mean you will never face challenges. Trust means challenges will not define your destiny. Trust does not mean you will never cry. Trust means your tears will not drown your faith. Some of you have experienced situations where everything looked lost. You thought there was no way out. You thought the story had ended. But somehow, something happened. A door opened. a person appeared, a solution emerged, a miracle happened. That was not coincidence. That was God. And if God did it before, God can do it again. But here is the difference. When you worry, you delay what God wants to do. When you trust, you align yourself with God's timing. God's timing is not always comfortable. God's timing is not always logical. God's timing is not always predictable. But God's timing is always perfect. Sometimes God waits until the last moment so that you can learn to trust beyond your understanding. Sometimes God allows pressure to increase so that your dependence on God can deepen. Sometimes God allows you to reach the end of your strength so that you can discover the beginning of divine strength. Trust grows in uncomfortable places. Trust matures in difficult seasons. Trust is refined in painful moments. If everything in your life was easy, you would never learn to trust deeply. If everything always worked according to your plans, you would never discover the power of surrender. If everything was always predictable, you would never experience the beauty of faith. Some of you want God to remove every challenge from your life. But sometimes God uses challenges to build your trust. Some of you want God to explain everything. But sometimes God uses silence to strengthen your faith. Trust is not built in moments of comfort. Trust is built in moments of uncertainty. When you trust, you stop asking, why is this happening to me? And you start asking, what is God teaching me through this? When you trust, you stop saying, I cannot handle this. And you start saying, God can handle this. When you trust, you stop seeing yourself as a victim and start seeing yourself as a vessel. Trust changes your identity. Worry makes you feel small. Trust makes you feel connected to something greater than yourself. Some of you have allowed worry to shape your personality. You have become anxious, suspicious, defensive, and tense. You expect disappointment. You prepare for failure. You imagine worst-case scenarios. But that is not who you were created to be. You were created to walk in confidence. You were created to live in peace. You were created to rest in God. Trust restores your original identity. Trust reconnects you with your true nature. Trust reminds you that you are not a victim of circumstances, but a participant in God's plan. When you trust, you stop chasing control and start embracing surrender. You realize that surrender is not losing. Surrender is gaining access to divine help. When you surrender to God, you do not become weaker, you become stronger. When you surrender to God, you do not lose direction, you gain clarity. When you surrender to God, you do not become passive, you become aligned with God's purpose. Worry makes you restless. Trust makes you stable. Worry makes you impatient. Trust makes you patient. Worry makes you reactive. Trust makes you responsive. Worry makes you focus on what you lack. Trust makes you focus on what God has. Some of you are waiting for God to prove himself before you trust. But God is waiting for you to trust before he reveals himself. Some of you are saying, if I see a miracle, then I will believe. But God is saying, if you believe, then you will see a miracle. Trust always comes before manifestation. A farmer plants seeds before he sees harvest. A builder lays foundations before he sees the house. A mother carries a child before she sees the baby. In the same way, you must plant trust before you see results. If you wait for everything to be perfect before you trust, you will never trust. If you wait for all your questions to be answered before you believe, you will never believe. If you wait for every fear to disappear before you surrender, you will never surrender. Trust is stepping forward even when the ground looks uncertain. Some of you are standing before doors that look closed. You are praying, crying, thinking, planning, worrying. But the door will not open until you change your approach. Stop knocking with worry. Start approaching with trust. Trust is not shouting at the door. Trust is resting before the door. Trust is not forcing the door. Trust is waiting for the right moment. Trust is not breaking the door. Trust is allowing God to open it. When God opens a door, nobody can close it. When God closes a door, nobody can open it. So why worry? Your worry cannot open what God has closed. Your worry cannot close what God has opened. Your worry cannot change God's will. But your trust can align you with God's will. Some of you are worried because you think you missed your chance. You think you wasted your opportunity. You think you destroyed your destiny. But trust tells you something different. Trust tells you that God is a God of restoration. Trust tells you that God can bring beauty out of ashes. Trust tells you that God can turn broken pieces into a new story. When you trust, you stop defining your life by your worst moments. You start defining your life by God's mercy. Some of you are worried because you feel unworthy. You feel like you do not deserve blessings. You feel like you are not good enough. But trust reminds you that God's grace is not based on your perfection. Trust reminds you that God's love is not earned. Trust reminds you that God's mercy is bigger than your mistakes. Worry says, I am finished. Worry says, there is no way. Trust says, God will make a way. Worry says, I am alone. Trust says, God is with me. Worry says, this is the end. Trust says, this is a new beginning. Trust is the door worry cannot open. When you trust, you experience freedom that worry can never give. You sleep better. You breathe better. You think clearer. You live lighter. You stop carrying burdens that were never meant for you. Some of you have been carrying emotional burdens for years. You carry guilt, regret, fear, anger, disappointment. These burdens have shaped your decisions, your relationships, your self-image. But trust invites you to release these burdens. When you trust, you realize that you do not have to understand everything to move forward. You do not have to solve everything to have peace. You do not have to control everything to feel secure. Trust teaches you to live one day at a time. Worry pulls you into tomorrow. Trust anchors you in today. Worry drags you into imaginary disasters. Trust keeps you connected to present grace. Worry creates problems that do not exist. Trust reveals solutions you did not expect. Some of you are tired not because you are working too hard, but because you are worrying too much. Your body is tired. Your mind is tired. Your spirit is tired. But trust brings rest. Rest is not laziness. Rest is spiritual confidence that God is working even when you are not. When you trust, you can rest in the middle of uncertainty. When you trust, you can smile in the middle of chaos. When you trust, you can remain calm in the middle of storms. That is not natural. That is supernatural. Trust connects you to something beyond human logic. Human logic says, worry when things are uncertain. Divine wisdom says, trust when things are uncertain. Human logic says, fear when you do not see answers. Divine wisdom says, believe even when you do not see answers. Human logic says, control everything. Divine wisdom says, surrender everything. Some of you have been living by human logic for too long. That is why your heart is restless. That is why your mind is noisy. That is why your spirit is heavy. But today, you are invited into a different way of living. A life of trust. Trust is not weakness. Trust is courage. It takes courage to trust when everything looks unstable. It takes courage to believe when everything looks impossible. It takes courage to surrender when everything inside you wants to control. But that courage opens doors that worry can never open. When you trust, you activate divine intervention. When you worry, you activate fear. Fear attracts more fear. Trust attracts divine help. Fear multiplies problems. Trust multiplies solutions. Fear darkens your vision. Trust clarifies your vision. Some of you are standing at a crossroads. One path is worry. The other path is trust. Worry looks familiar. Worry feels natural. Worry seems logical. Trust looks risky. Trust feels uncertain. Trust seems irrational. But only one path leads to peace. Only one path leads to freedom. Only one path leads to divine intervention. Trust is the door worry cannot open. When you choose trust, you are not denying reality. You are choosing a higher reality. When you choose trust, you are not ignoring facts. You are acknowledging that God is bigger than facts. When you choose trust, you are not escaping responsibility. You are placing responsibility in the right hands. Some of you think that if you trust, people will take advantage of you. But trusting God does not make you foolish. It makes you wise. Trust in God does not make you passive. It makes you discerning. Trust in God does not make you weak. It makes you resilient. Trust changes the way you see people. Trust changes the way you handle conflict. Trust changes the way you respond to disappointment. When you trust, you stop reacting with bitterness. You start responding with wisdom. When you trust, you stop holding grudges. You start releasing forgiveness. When you trust, you stop being controlled by emotions. You start being guided by purpose. Some of you have allowed worry to shape your relationships. You worry about being abandoned, so you cling too tightly. You worry about being betrayed, so you build walls. You worry about being rejected, so you hide your true self. But trust heals relationships. When you trust God, you stop demanding perfection from people. You stop expecting people to fill the place of God in your life. You stop putting unrealistic pressure on others. Trust liberates you from emotional slavery. Trust is not just about big miracles. Trust is about daily living. Trust when you wake up in the morning. Trust when you face uncertainty. Trust when you receive bad news. Trust when you feel confused. Trust when you feel tired. Trust when you feel afraid. Trust is not a one-time decision. Trust is a lifestyle. Every day, you choose between worry and trust. Every moment, you choose between fear and faith. Every situation, you choose between control and surrender. And every time you choose trust, you open a door that worry can never open. Some of you are still waiting for everything to make sense before you trust. But trust often comes before understanding. Some of you are waiting for your emotions to calm down before you trust. But trust often comes before emotional stability. Trust is not based on feelings. Trust is based on conviction. Feelings change, situations change, people change. But God does not change. When you trust God, you anchor your life in something unchanging. Worry anchors your life in uncertainty. Trust anchors your life in divine stability. Some of you have been praying for God to change your circumstances. But God is more interested in changing your heart. Because when your heart changes, your circumstances will eventually change. Worry changes nothing. Trust changes everything. Worry makes you see obstacles. Trust makes you see opportunities. Worry makes you focus on what is missing. Trust makes you focus on what is possible. Some of you are afraid of letting go. You think if you let go of worry, you will lose control. But the truth is, you never had control in the first place. The illusion of control is one of the biggest sources of anxiety. Trust frees you from the illusion of control. When you trust, you stop fighting battles that are not yours. When you trust, you stop carrying weights that are not yours. When you trust, you stop trying to fix things that only God can fix. Trust is not escape. Trust is alignment. Alignment with God's will. Alignment with God's timing. Alignment with God's purpose. When you are aligned, doors open naturally. Not because you forced them. Not because you worried enough. Not because you struggled enough. But because you trusted. Trust is the door worry cannot open. And the more you understand this, the more your life begins to shift. You begin to see problems differently. You begin to see delays differently. You begin to see people differently. You begin to see yourself differently. You stop seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances. You start seeing yourself as a participant in divine orchestration. You stop asking, why me? You start asking, what is God doing through this? You stop asking, what if everything fails? You start asking, what if God is working everything out? Your inner language changes. Your emotional climate changes. Your spiritual atmosphere changes. And when your atmosphere changes, your reality begins to change. Trust is not magic. Trust is alignment with divine reality. When you align with divine reality, earthly reality eventually adjusts. Some of you want instant miracles, but sometimes the greatest miracle is the transformation of your heart. A heart that no longer trembles at every challenge. A heart that no longer collapses at every disappointment. A heart that no longer panics at every uncertainty. That heart is built by trust. Worry breaks hearts. Trust builds hearts. Worry weakens spirits. Trust strengthens spirits. Worry fragments minds. Trust stabilizes minds. Some of you have been praying for peace. But peace is not something God drops on worried hearts. Peace grows in trusting hearts. When you trust, peace flows naturally. When you worry, peace disappears. Trust is not something you wait for. Trust is something you practice. You practice trust when you choose calm over panic. You practice trust when you choose faith over fear. You practice trust when you choose surrender over control. And every time you practice trust, you step closer to doors that worry can never open. Doors of peace, doors of restoration, doors of divine intervention, doors of unexpected miracles, doors of inner freedom, doors of spiritual maturity, doors of purpose, doors of destiny. Worry stands outside these doors, knocking endlessly, but never entering. Trust walks in effortlessly. Because trust carries the key. And the more you trust, the more you realize that the door was never locked by God. It was only blocked by fear, hesitation, and doubt. And the moment you release worry and embrace trust, the door begins to open from the inside.